Malaysia is endowed with oil and natural gas resources, yet it imports billions of dollars of fuel from neighboring Singapore each year. Don't believe me? Here's a graph on the largest imports of Malaysia from Singapore for the year 2024. Here you can see that the largest belongs to electronics, but following that, the second largest is oils and fuels, totaling over $9.4 billion. That seems weird, isn't it? Malaysia not only has abundance in oil and natural gas resources, but Singapore is well known to have very little natural resources, and that includes oil and gas. The city-state has virtually no oil or gas reserves of its own. And what makes this even more striking is the fact that if we were to graph out Malaysia's largest refined petroleum imports by origin, we get to see that Singapore stands at the top. For 2023, Malaysia imported refined petroleum of over $9.41 billion from Singapore, which is more than double when compared to China, its second largest source of importation. So, how can this be? How can a country with virtually no hydrocarbon reserves of its own be a major fuel supplier to Malaysia? Well, in reality, Singapore has built itself into a global energy refining and trading hub. To understand what this simply means, we must define what Singapore actually exports to Malaysia. As we mentioned earlier, the fuel trade between the two countries is primarily refined petroleum products. These aren't crude oil or natural gas in their raw forms, but finished fuels ready for use in vehicles, power plants, and industries. So, how does this work for Singapore? Well, it works when Singapore imports crude oil from around the world, primarily the Middle East, West Africa, and even some from Malaysia itself. These crude oil are then processed into Singapore's refineries. They process them into a slate of products: gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, fuel oil, and LPG. These crude oil are essentially refined only in 3 major refineries, owned by companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, and Singapore Refining Company. They have a combined crude refining capacity of around 1.3 million barrels per day, BPD. This makes Singapore one of the largest refining centres in the world, despite its small size. For comparison, Singapore's refining capacity is larger than Malaysia's, which is just under 1.0 million barrels per day in 2023. Moreover, Singapore's role as a trading hub means that not only state-owned Petronas, but also international trading houses, Glencore, Trafigura, Vitol, etc., buy crude cargoes, refine them, and sell the products on global and regional markets. Malaysian oil companies and fuel distributors tap into this liquid market. They can source specific product grades on short notice, hedge against price volatility, and ensure supply continuity if domestic refineries undergo maintenance. This is why, if we were to graph out some of the largest refined petroleum exports globally in 2023, we get to see that Singapore is actually one of the largest. They had for that year exports of over $55.9 billion, which surpassed India, China, and nearly every single country out there. Then, that is also why, if we were to graph out Singapore's imports by category, we also get to see they buy a lot of crude petroleum, petroleum gas, coal tar oil, and so on. These are the raw and intermediate petroleum products that Singapore needs to feed its refineries and petrochemical plants. With such refineries, this made the world and Malaysia reliant on Singaporean refineries. Trade data over the last 10 to 15 years even shows that Malaysia's refined fuel imports have grown substantially, with Singapore always a leading supplier. Malaysia's imports of refined petroleum more than tripled in value from around $7.9 billion in 2010 to about $28.6 billion in 2023. Throughout this period, Singapore remained the top source, though Malaysia has diversified somewhat. In 2010, about 67% of Malaysia's imported refined petroleum, by value, came from Singapore. By 2023, Singapore accounted for roughly 1/3 of Malaysia's refined fuel import value. about $9.3 billion out of $28.6 billion. Singapore is consistently the #1 supplier, with other countries like China, South Korea, the UAE, and, more recently, even Russia filling in the rest. Now, it is important to know that although Malaysia does import a lot of refined petroleum from Singapore, they also export a lot of petroleum back to the city-state. Raw and intermediate petroleum products that Singapore needs to feed its refineries and petrochemical plants. Does this mean that Malaysia does not refine its own fuel? Well, they do. Malaysia is often described as a net energy exporter. It produces more oil and gas than it consumes in aggregate. Indeed, Malaysia produces crude oil, about 600,000 barrels per day in recent years, and is a major exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG. However, Malaysia's status is nuanced. It exports crude oil and natural gas, but imports a lot of refined petroleum products. This is partly due to the types of oil Malaysia produces and its internal demand patterns. For instance, oil production versus consumption. Malaysia's crude oil production has been declining from earlier peaks, and it primarily produces light, sweet crude, like the renowned Tapis blend, which is very high quality. Malaysia exports a significant portion of its crude oil, especially the high-grade oil, because it fetches a premium price on the international market. Buyers in countries like Japan, Korea, and Australia prize Malaysia's light crude. On the other hand, Malaysia's domestic consumption is largely for refined fuels, gasoline, diesel, etc., which in total volume can exceed the volume of oil it produces. For instance, Malaysia's petroleum product consumption in 2022 was roughly 0.7 to 0.8 million barrels per day, with gasoline and diesel being the largest portions, nearly equal to its crude output. As domestic demand grew, Malaysia went from being self-sufficient in some fuels to needing imports to cover all its needs. Following that, Malaysia currently has 7 refineries, some owned by Petronas, plus others by Shell's successor, and Petron, with a combined nameplate capacity of about 997,000 barrels per day as of 2023. In theory, this capacity is almost enough to meet Malaysia's domestic fuel requirements. However, in practice, not all refineries run at full capacity all the time. Maintenance, unplanned outages, or product slate limitations, and the product mix might not match exact domestic demand. For example, a refinery can produce only a certain ratio of diesel to gasoline. If Malaysian drivers need more gasoline than the refineries yield, the extra must be imported from elsewhere. In essence, Malaysia's own oil is a premium resource that it often sells internationally for profit, while it buys back cheaper fuel for domestic use. An industry expert explained it succinctly. We export premium crude to earn USD and import cheaper crude, or fuels, to process and supply locally. Sell high, buy low. Malaysia's refineries are actually optimized to run cheaper heavy crudes, like Middle East grades, rather than its light Tapis crude. So Malaysia might import heavy crude, or let Singapore do the refining of imported crude, to produce the fuels it needs. This strategy maximizes the value of Malaysia's resources. The high-grade oil brings in revenue, and the populace still gets the necessary petrol and diesel, often refined from more cost-efficient inputs. To illustrate the economic rationale, consider a simplified scenario. Malaysia's Tapis crude might sell for a premium, say $100 plus per barrel, when average oil is $90, due to its quality. Malaysia can sell that and earn hard currency. Meanwhile, Malaysia can buy refined fuel that was made from a cheaper Middle Eastern crude that Singapore imported. Effectively, the feedstock cost for that fuel might have been lower. Malaysia ends up paying, say, $95 per barrel worth of refined product. The country has gained in the trade by leveraging quality arbitrage. Everyone wins. Malaysia's consumers get fuel, Petronas gets profit from crude exports, and Singapore's refiners and traders earn a margin by supplying the product. In the future, however, Malaysia is expanding some refining capacity and attempting to optimize its energy mix, for example, to reduce subsidy burdens, which could alter import needs. Singapore, for its part, is also looking to pivot in the long term towards cleaner energy, but for now remains an oil hub. It's likely that in the near future, the symbiotic trade of oil and fuel between the two neighbours will persist. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.